Okay, let's get started. I'm very, very excited to have Chaitanya talk to us today. I've known him for a very long time and followed his career basically sort of almost like I would describe his paper as, find your own adventure kind of. And it's a little bit also exemplified, I guess, in the title, from cells to society. So I have no idea what he's going to talk to us about today, but I'm sure it'll be absolutely exciting. Yeah, please tell us about your adventure. And thanks for coming. Thanks for agreeing to do this. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you, Anna, for actually organizing this. I mean, I wasn't sure like how, like it's so hard right now to get speakers but far away, because even though it's online, you think that, oh yeah, it's all should be possible. We can't still, of course, overcome the time zone differences, of course, at some point. So actually, thanks for making it possible to be able to still do it. And yeah, it has been quite like an adventure. I think I like we know, like I know Oana from almost 10 years or a decade or more now. I think it was 2009.
Let's call it two. Let's call it two.
So it's been quite a long time. And yeah, that from that point onwards, like we were sure like where things are going to go, and it wasn't really clear. But what I was sure of that was wanted to go into evolutionary theory. And one of the nice things about evolutionary theory is that it does go across scales of organization, because inherently the mathematics which is behind it, it is pretty much scale free. So one can actually move between levels of organization, as I say here, from cells to societies. And I have been fortunate enough to be able to enjoy this freedom of going across scales. And one of the nice places where I've been spending most of the last 10 years has been in Plön. So Oana has been there. It's a very beautiful place. It's kind of almost like an island surrounded by 5 different massive lakes. And it's in northern Germany, so it's not that far from Denmark, actually. And it's a small village, but so it's not really the hustle bustle of a city life. And there you can just sit back, relax, and enjoy the nature while you try to think of hopefully some interesting problems. And the ones which we decided to think of in our group are more or less, you could try to put them in these 4 different categories: mutualism, antagonism, in which actually those are specific, definitely topics which I mention here, but overall those encompass the ecological part, and population genetics and evolutionary game theory. And the techniques or the tools which we actually use to study all of this come from, of course, physics, mathematics, computational techniques, definitely, and experimental biology, which is also a technique actually that we are using for exploring our theories. Now, I have to mention here that evolutionary game theory and population genetics, they are all not just tools as stated here, but they actually form the research themes, because we also want to actively develop these fields and the theories within them. So it's not just that we make use of them, but we are also trying to actively contribute to the toolbox as such. So as I was saying, the nice thing about using these techniques is that they go across the scales of organization, right? Like you can actually look at dynamics between molecules and chemical systems all the way to culture and ideas and social systems. But one of the questions which definitely you start with, like, okay, what would be the common and the different things between these scales of organization? For example, the common thread which goes across these scales of organization, and one when thinks about it, and of course, as usual with many of the things in retrospect, it's obvious that there are interactions. There are interactions within each scale of organization. There are interactions between the scales of organization at all different levels. And that is precisely where we want to position our research. But the nice thing is we are not just limited to this one axis. What we are also interested in is trying to understand if we can move away from just the abstract studies on these levels of organization and translate some of the results that which we are getting into the real world? Can we actually come up with some meaningful, say, solutions to real world problems, or at least have a say in some of them, like where things might go? Given the current situation we are all in, I don't really have to stress the importance of translating basic research into and some kind of applied perspective. So that makes it very clear. But of course, how do you span across this broad space, across scales of organization and across the translational levels? So typically, given the audience, I usually pick and choose. I say like, all right, mostly this would be good for a certain kind of audience, whereas the other topic would be good. But I was not really sure how to bring across the research, our research to the really broad audience that we do have here. So what I decided to do was like, I'll go on two different topics, and that was from cells to societies. And rather I thought like, okay, let me actually pick a example from the cells and actually an example from the societal level, and try to see how we can go across the translational level with these two concepts. And the first one I will go for is for the synthetic biology, and the second one would be on beliefs. So for synthetic biology, I mean, I don't know, I mean, Oana, you can stop me, but I don't know what the format is, but if anyone has any questions, I think I would be happy to be interrupted anytime. So yeah, so I would start with the first topic, which is that of the synthetic biology and the intervention dilemma, as we try to call it. And why are we actually even talking about this, and where do we go? Like what was the hook actually that got me actually involved into this? And that was when looking at certain examples of anthropogenic change that we are facing in the world today. And this is just an example of the coral dinoflagellate symbiosis, which is a relationship between corals and the microalgae that live in them, which are the dinoflagellates, which actually provide the nutrients to the corals and give them many a times these beautiful colors. And we know that these are the ones which give them their nice colors is because under stress, which is like a drastic like temperature changes, or if there's a lot of pollution in the water, or even just too much sunlight, that's when we get this coral bleaching, where basically these dinoflagellates, they just leave the corals. They perform what is known as a mass exodus, and the corals are then just left white. And basically that's a very clear sign of a reef under stress. Now I have to, because we all know how science changes with every new study, there is a new hypothesis that the relationship between corals and these dinoflagellates may not be a perfect symbiosis or mutualism in that sense, but might be a bit more enslavement process. But that is a new hypothesis which is still being explored. But that still doesn't change the fact that there are two different species which are interacting with each other, one providing some benefit to the other, and the second one providing a benefit to the first. And such kind of systems have been studied like for a very long time, all the way back to chemotons, actually, which was actually at the beginning of the last century, but really brought to the fore by Manfred Eigen in his studies of the hypercycles, which is like an abstract construct in which you have these different entities which help the reproduction of the other entities and sometimes also themselves. So you can get these nice networks and webs of interactions in which you have these mutual catalysis going on. And that leads to some very nice patterns of self-organization, which has been very nicely explored by Manfred Eigen, and after that, a lot of people. But what has been shown actually by John Maynard Smith as well, and what has been shown that these kind of hypercycles, as they are called, they are quite good actually at surviving extreme conditions. So you do, like, not probably the simple ones, like the one which is shown in this picture, but like these ones, but if they are highly interconnected, then you have these inbuilt redundancies in them, so which allow them to survive even if one of them gets knocked out, the cycle by itself the other members of the cycle can still survive because of the inbuilt redundancies. And that's actually a very nice component of a complex system, which is even such a complex system has been simplified over here, I would say. But what we do see right now is that you can build such kind of systems artificially. For example, this sustainable replication and coevolution of cooperative RNAs, as you can see over here in the first paper, but in an artificial cell-like system, where you have interactions between two different RNA molecules, which self-catalyze, as well as catalyze the reproduction of the other RNA. Now, these are the questions which, well, these are the ways in which one can start asking the questions about the origins of life or origins of replication and and metabolism in a different style. Or we could go all the way to the other extreme, which is about synthetic biology for terraformation. And that acts at the level of communities of microbes. So what happens when microbial communities actually help the catalysis, or basically in that case, now the catalysis becomes a mutualistic interaction between a different strain of the microbes in which they help the reproduction of the other kind of microbes. And do we find networks which support each other in such a way that the whole community is stable over time? Now, this has been a very hot topic. Like, can we construct mutualistic systems so that they can go and colonize, say, a different niche which we want to be colonized and terraformed in that manner? Or you could think of this in terms of industrial usage, where you want to form a robust community which will go and eat the oil spill from and clean up the oceans. I mean, this is amazingly varied potential and uses which are only just limited by your imagination. But how do we engineer actually basically such kind of a symbiosis? And here I give a very simple example of something that we did, which is you think of two different yeast strains, right? And this is yeast strain 1, strain 2. And both of these yeast strains, they need the amino acids like adenine and lysine to live. But one of them produces only adenine, whereas the other one produces only lysine. So when you put them together in the mixture, then they survive in a mixture in which there is no external adenine and lysine, that is. So of course, when you put them together, then they will survive, and then they will form what is known as this very nice community. And one can say in a very idealized manner, sure, if you start with some different fractions, relative fractions of these yeast isolates, then they will evolve to some kind of an equilibrium over time. Now, we did these experiments and tried to understand what is the contribution of the adenine and lysine so that they reach some kind of an equilibrium. And the equilibrium is, well, it's not at 50-50, it's about at 0.6. Now, this one can explain by the uptake rates of adenine and lysine. But in principle, all right, that works very fine. But our question was, this is not the ideal case, right? I mean, the laboratory is not the ideal case where we want this to be. What would happen once you have such kind of a symbiotic system and you want to put it out in nature, where you want it to do some work for you? And as soon as you put it outside, the ecology will add stresses to this engineered system. Now, we try to highlight at least 3 different ways in which we envision such kind of stresses. So for example, you have this system as I described before, but what happens if you have this additional lysine in this case, or one of the metabolites which is required into the system already? And this is actually well understood phenomena in these kind of interventions are very well understood phenomena in ecology, which is known as, for example, point source enrichment, where suddenly you get a windfall of a lot of nutrients for a while. Or it could be a seasonal or periodic introduction, which is by definition seasonal, and you see that happening in nature all the time. Or there could be permanent changes which are introduced by things like humans, which are changing the ecology of what was previously a properly working community. And we tried to understand this by actually then disturbing our community, which was this adenine and lysine dependent yeast strains, by adding different amounts of adenine and lysine. So the only takeaway, I think, because there are the experimental results as well as the computational results for this, but what I would like to bring your attention to is these numbers, basically 0.2 and 0.8. And the three different graphs are basically initial supplementation, which is this point enrichment, where you start with a large amount of, say, lysine or adenine. Intermittent would be you add a certain amount of your disturbance at certain time intervals over time. And the continuous is that basically continuously you're adding it into the system. And what I mentioned before, like the equilibrium was like at 0.6, right? But here you can see where the system will lie most of the times as you increase the concentration of adenine and the lysine as relative to the adenine as well. And you see that actually the system has a large region where most of the times you have the relative fraction of adenine is very high, the yeast strain, which is actually producing only adenine, that is very high because it gets a lot of lysine to work with. And the orange would be the one where you always see the lysine plus strain. And this region gets larger and larger over here, here, and here, as you're adding more and more basically disturbance in these different kinds of fashions. And that's what we wanted to highlight, that basically if you define some kind of a Goldilocks zone, that this is where we want the community to exist. But as soon as you start adding disturbances to that community, you will actually destabilize the community and move it outside its Goldilocks zone so that it's very hard for it to then survive. And then you can make it easily vulnerable to further ecological stressors, because then already the community is not functioning as it's supposed to function. Now, this
Can I
is
ask
something.
a question really quickly?
Yeah, sure.
Because I see a lot of my students in my modeling evolution class are participating. So we talk a lot in that class about, evolutionary dynamics as a function of the parameters. So when you talk about this equilibrium, right, around 0.6, and also as this equilibrium changes, can you say a little bit more about the model and what are the parameters that go into this equilibrium, right?
So,
as you build your cycle and your model. Yes.
Right. So I did not go into the details of this model here because I wanted to go into the math model of the second one. And this I thought would be a bit too easy then. But this basically has parameters which act over here and over here, which are basically the uptake rates of the nutrients and the reproduction rates of the two different strains. So there are, you could say, 4 different parameters over here. And these are the ones which we actually parameterize from the experiments, from these experimental results. So what would be the growth rates in isolation? If you provide the, say, adenine plus a lot of lysine, and what would be the growth rate of lysine plus if you just provide it a lot of adenine in isolation? So when the two strains are not put together. So you can find out the growth rates of them independently and then put them together. So one can actually also extract the uptake rates of lysine and adenine when they are actually put together. And once you have all of these parameters, one can then subject that system to additional amount of adenine or lysine, and then see which is the adenine and lysine which is getting actually used. So we are actually tracking not just here, let me show in this cartoon. As you can see, we don't really track just the yeast strains, which are the solid lines, but we have actually been also tracking adenine and lysine concentrations. So if imagine you're adding now more lysine, you're basically starting with this point very high up over here. And if we do that, then the adenine strain of yeast gets a big boost because there is a lot of lysine just lying around, which it can use. And this destabilizes the equilibrium. Now, how much of it destabilizes definitely depends on this additional amount of lysine. And that is exactly what we have been exploring in those, these plots over here. Does that help a bit? I'm sorry, I didn't.
Yes.
I didn't explicitly put any equations right now over here because I thought like I want to focus on one of them for the equations. But I would be happy to show more. Like if anyone is interested, then I would be gladly going in. So those are the ones actually which are described mostly in this manuscript in M systems. Yeah, as I was saying, like, so the corals is just one of the examples that we started with because that was a very good motivation where the impact of the anthropogenic activities is very clear. But that's not just the only one. Like, for example, if you think of pesticide use, I mean, the nitrogen fixing rhizobia and the host plants, which are a lot of leguminous plants, they have evolved this mutualistic relationship where the rhizobia fix nitrogen in the plant nodule, the roots of the plants in the nodules where the plants can actually make use of it. And then the bacteria can get nutrients, like mostly carbon, back from the plants. Now, this is a very nice mutualism which has been studied extensively. But just by making use of heavy use of pesticides, one basically breaks down this mutualism because the plants don't need, in principle, these bacteria to be there to fix the nitrogen because we are already providing it in the pesticides as well as the external fertilizers. But what we can do now knowing this problem, is that we can use synthetic biology to engineer nitrogen symbiosis in cereals, where we actually then get rid of the use of pesticides and fertilizers, such that we don't need to add it externally, but we actually strengthen this symbiosis so much that there is no need to add external supplementation in that manner. And then one can just focus on pesticides, which are nitrogen free. And again, what I want to show with this citations is that this is not just a hypothetical story, but actually people are doing this thing in agriculture. And this is a fragile technology, and it's fragile because of the ecology it needs to work in, because there are a lot of parameters which we do not know of. But the potential for this is amazing because you can use it, you can imagine its use from, as I mentioned, cleaning oil spills, controlling eutrophication, fixing nitrogen, or basically wherever the environment has reached an excess or an extreme where the natural mutualistic processes are not sufficient, as highlighted here by Ricard Solé. But you can also think about it in a different way. What if we are not designing the evolutionary construct, but actually designing the ecology in which these evolutionary constructs live? Because that's also another way of constructing these modules, basically, which one can just export into the ecology where we want to use it. And in that sense, then we could actually evolve or guide evolution in the way that we want. And again, this is an opinion piece, but very recently, I mean, I don't want to quote anything more other than the title itself, which is Synthetic Biology for Terraformation Lessons from Mars, Earth, and the Microbiome, which again goes back to what I was mentioning before, that because it follows from the mathematical equivalence between these different scales of complexity, one can actually start to make such kind of statements. But the thing is, these need to be also driven by experiments which follow that. Now, the nice thing is that synthetic biology is not also a hypothetical thing, right? We are coming very far with this technology, and it is proceeding with digital precision, at rapid digital precision. For example, in 2011, people were imagining like what would it be if we were able to construct genetic logic gates for robust digital like synthetic biology. And what I mean by this is that you need a logic gate, a genetic logic gate, where if you do have a certain kind of an input, we would be guaranteed to see a certain output from the bacterium. Now in 2021, which is an extremely recent story here, people have not just constructed genetic gates within a bacterium, but you can construct genetic gates, logic gates within communities of bacteria itself. And now if you think about this, the applications of these are amazing. So if you want to test what kind of product is there in, say, a sewage system of a certain city, this would act just like a litmus test where you put this community of bacteria and they glow up green or they glow red, given what kind of products do they sense from those, from whatever your test material is, basically. This is just one of the examples, but you can imagine, like, as soon as you are constructing gates, yeah, you open up a whole new way of doing computation, basically, on the microbial communities, or using the microbial communities in that sense. Now, I don't want to go further into these speculations, but I just want to leave you here with this thought and just hold this thought for this topic. None of this work would have been possible, actually, without Jai Denton, together with whom we did the experimental work when he was at the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology in Japan. Now he's moved to Australia. And yeah, you can read some of it further here, where one of them is actually more an ethical and legal piece, where we wanted to expose what the current technology would mean if we actually happen to use it, whereas in the second manuscript, we actually try to develop it. Now, to make this leap from synthetic biology, which you could imagine worked at, say, this side of the spectrum a bit, all the way now to the right side over here, where we try to understand something about beliefs. I know, I mean, this is a drastic jump, but I hope I'll get to the point which I want to make in the end, where we put this together. Now, the specific topic about beliefs that I want to talk about is collective narratives and how they help catalyze cooperation. Or in a more extensive manner, what I want to talk about is beliefs in narratives, and irrespective of their moral content, rather, how they can catalyze cooperation. Now, this work actually started when Marcus Freehan was visiting our institute over here from Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand, where I spent about 2 years, not in Wellington, but in Auckland. But we had a very good rapport over there, and he was coming over here to discuss ideas about the evolution of money. And that's spun off into a different project. But one of the questions which stuck with us at that point was, why is money such a great story that we believe in? And what are other such great stories, and why are they told? And what I mean by money as being a story is that when it moved on to becoming a fiat currency, where it doesn't really have any intrinsic value as such anymore, but we all choose to believe that it does have value, which is the only way we trust each other, that we trust that we all believe that this has value. For example, that's one of the ways cryptocurrencies, or basically mostly all the currencies nowadays work, right? That we all choose that to believe that this piece of metal does have value, or this piece of paper does have value, which you can actually exchange for some kind of product. Now, this is a story that we tell each other, and we all believe in it. So why would this be a very successful story? And for getting to such kind of problems together, we decided to team up with Joseph Bulbulia, who is who is doing actually religious studies at also the University of Victoria, and who is doing cultural evolution on the evolution of religion. And it was after much discussions that actually we ended up with, like, what is it, the content of the story that actually matters, or it doesn't really matter what the story is about, but just that we believe in it. So if there are stories with morals, then sure, I mean, then we know that if you look at hunter-gatherer storytelling behaviors, there are a lot of stories which do have very strong moral value in it. And they are used to disseminate those values within the community. And those stories then definitely proliferate because the communities are benefiting definitely from the spread of such stories. For example, here are just 4 of such stories in the ETA communities in the Philippines, which highlight the social norms of friendship, cooperation, and social equality as such. And this, while is always used as a very good example of, okay, that's why stories spread and that's why they are good for us, and that should be the end of it. But the question actually comes then, what happens about stories which also exist without such kind of a moral underpinning? Now, this is just one example. For example, in the Maori culture, the primordial deities, Rangi and Papa, are connected in a loving embrace that encompasses all of reality. And the world is created when one of their children, Tane, pushes his parents apart, thus giving rise to the separation of the sky, which was the Rangi, and earth, Papa. And since then, the primordial couple has lived in longing for each other with little or no regard for their children or for that matter, mortals. It's not just for us, but even if you ask the Maori people following the Maori culture or coming from it, like what is the moral significance, or what do we take away from this? They're like, it's not very clear actually what it means. Actually, different communities even have different perceptions of what this actually signifies. So what happens actually when you actually have these kind of stories being told is that it is creating an alternate reality. These narratives are creating a reality which are different maybe from the objective reality. Now, this is going back to just saying that, okay, what happens if you do have an objective reality, such as a predator-prey system, or rocks, or trees, or mates and offspring, which one can quantitatively measure, versus subjective realities in which you choose to believe in animal spirits, gods, demons, limited liability companies. A stark example of this is basically you have an RGB scale for a color and you can't dispute on that scale much, but the color on the right, it's like, it's a bit lighter red than what I think is a proper red, or a bit darker red than that. That's very subjective meaning. So what actually this does is that it splits up the narrative into an object. The narrative actually starts creating into this objective and subjective reality. But the thing is, many of such narratives, which are, say, maybe subjective, they actually start exerting a force in the objective reality. And we know a lot of examples of this. Like, we all know that these kind of subjective institutions now, in this case, which have come up from subjective reasoning, they have a very real and tangible force in our actual lives. So how do we go about actually putting these stories together in a model which one can try to understand, where we start trusting each other by making use of these kind of stories? And for that, I would like to imagine early hominids in their pristine landscape, say, which is made up of only the objective reality. And we choose the stag hunt game to illustrate the problem of trust. And for those who do not know the stag hunt game, it's a simple interaction, say, for example, between 2 individuals, which has been shown on the left. You have 2 different strategies, right? You have to go and you have to decide whether you want to go hunt a stag or you want to go hunt a hare. Now, hunting a hare is pretty easy. You just go hunt a hare by yourself. You don't need to know what the other person is doing, which is given by the column player here. But the thing is, if you decide to go for hunting a stag, but the other person that you're going out hunting with decides to go for a hare, then you are not going to be able to hunt a stag. Then you just come back empty-handed and then you'll be hungry. But if you both coordinate on hunting the stag, only then it is possible to get the stag. And what this one shows is that means there is a certain number of, or fraction of, individuals in the population who need to follow this stag strategy then to be able to successfully hunt stags, which gives you a larger payoff. Otherwise, actually, it's better to be a hare hunter. And then you go to the left in that simplex, basically, which is shown here. I hope this is clear. What this problem actually signifies is the tension between a larger social gain, right? You could get this larger social gain, which is possible only if you are working socially, if you work together. And that of a guaranteed, but a smaller one, personal gain. So this is basically the tension between the two levels, which has been exemplified here. And this problem has been used a lot of times for the evolution, like trying to understand the evolution of trust. How do we get trusting behavior basically between individuals? Now let's move on from this pristine hominid situation, and after the formulation of what is known as the cognitive revolution and cultural evolution, where humans actually could start coming up with stories. Now, our study, we don't really go into the mechanics of how the cognitive revolution takes place, but given that it takes place and humans start asking questions about their reality, we could ask again the same question, that given in a certain reality, you could do hare hunting or stag hunting. In this alternate reality, what would you do? Would you also hunt hares or would you also hunt stags? Now, it doesn't really matter, right, what you actually do here, as long as all that you are doing or all that the reality that you are seeing is going to be the objective reality, because that's what matters. And we all know what you would do in an objective reality, say hunt hares, because it's very hard to understand what the other person is going to be doing. So it's safe to hunt hares. Only if you know that the other individual is hunting stags, then it makes sense to hunt stags, but there is no guarantee at that point. So what is the repertoire of strategies which is in principle possible in these two realities and two actions in each reality? Now, this is just to show that what an individual could be doing is that it could be hunting hare in reality 1 and hunting hare in reality 2. But what we add onto this model is an internal preference for the individual, that which reality that individual believes in. Is it reality 1 or is it reality 2? Right? So given this kind of formulation, what we get are different types of individuals who have different actions possible. We are not saying that this is already given, but these actions are in principle possible, that you have action 1 in reality 1, action 2 in reality 2, and then you have a preference of which kind of reality you actually prefer. That doesn't mean that you end up doing that, but that's just one's preference. Now, clearly what I was mentioning on before, that we start in the place where everyone is in the objective reality. That is 1. That's their preference, because they basically don't know about the other reality. And they are hunting hares. So that's the first edge. Well, in this case, just for completeness, we have given that in the second reality, they would also be doing edge, but it doesn't really matter because that is never happening. So the population dynamics as it progresses is that given that this is our population of individuals, say we choose a group of size G who are going to go out and hunt for today's meal. Now in this particular population, when they are going to go out and hunt, it doesn't really matter what the other individuals are doing, right? Because we know that everyone is going to be hunting hares. There is no point in forming a group of such. It's just that there are G individuals who are going hunting and each one of them will get a hare. So the average payoff, that's what we mean over here, is that everyone gets a hare. That's it. That's the average payoff for HH1. The interesting question comes, and if the group is of mixed individuals of these different kinds of strategies that we mentioned before, and now if from this population, we form a group of size G, what would be the average payoff of an individual in such a mixed case? Now, this is what we want to actually calculate. And now this requires basically some bookkeeping. But before going into that bookkeeping, we first want to decide that when individuals are going out hunting, how do they decide which reality are they in? Because in the first case, when everyone was hunting hares, that was never a question. But as soon as you have this mixture of individuals, one starts seeing different opinions. And then how does one decide what is the actual reality that one is going out? So if you're going out hunting and then one says, no, you have to, if today we went on the right side of that tree, that's a good sign to go hunt stags. Now we are in this other fictional reality. Now this is where we try to make use of the concept of what is known as groupthink, where you think that the knowledge of others is the knowledge of, is also your knowledge, right? I mean, if you ask people like, do you know how a zip works? Everyone said, yeah, of course, we know how zip works. But one asks them, okay, let's write down the model for the working of a zip. It should be obvious, right? But it's not that straightforward then. So this assumption that, of course, we know how it works because it's a well-known thing. This is the idea that we try to use over here, which is known as groupthink, where you just, in this case, now we just do frequency-dependent selection of what is the prominent strategy of that group. And if it happens to be 1, then that's the probability that with F1, the group reality is going to be 1. And with complementary probability, it's going to be reality 2. Once we know what the group reality is, that is given by F1, the another question which comes in, what is the group composition? How many of the individuals actually are believing in reality 1, and how many of them are actually believing in reality 2? That needs to be calculated, which just follows a binomial sampling in this case. But it also matters who you are in that case, because that will tell what kind of outcome you're going to get. And this delta A1 or delta A2 star is just giving you a 1 or 0 result if you are a hare hunter or not. And what we need actually, if you're going to go out hunting, is to find out what is the group composition according to the hunting preference. Because how many of those hunters who believe in a certain reality are stag hunters or hare hunters? So that's why we also need to understand the composition of the group with respect to the hunting preference, not just the reality preference, which was given here. Now, after all of this thing, are there enough hunters? So given that, okay, you finally end up with number of hunters, NO, N tilde, and O tilde, which given these previous calculations, you calculate, okay, these many individuals are now believing in our reality. And in this reality, we are going to be hunting stags. Are there enough stag hunters? Because in the example which I gave you before, there were 2 hunters which were going out. And if they both hunted stag, you get a stag. Now here we are forming a group of size G. And then we say that you need at least M hunters in your population, so that in your group, so that you can actually have a successful stag hunt. So you can't go in a group of size G and say only 2 of them are stag hunters. That doesn't get you a stag. Maybe you at least need half of the group to be stag hunters. And that's what this M gives you. Now we put all of this information together, and finally we can calculate what is the probability that you will actually hunt a hare, or what is the probability that you will actually hunt a stag, which again, when put together, gives us the average payoff of each of the strategies that we are actually interested in. Now, as I said, like this looks like it's a lot of moving parts in here, but it's basically just bookkeeping of how many individuals of how many type are there, and how do you add them together for calculating the averages. But once we have that, what we can do is try to understand how the dynamics looks in this space of 8 different strategies. Now, the way it's been arranged over here, actually things get much simple, because this might look complicated in the interior, but if you see all the connections which are in the interior, you always have this unstable point, the point which I mentioned earlier, that you need at least a threshold amount to go over to the other side. Now, in a deterministic system, in a very large the population, one is never going to cross over here. So if we are starting at HH1, as I mentioned before, all we need to focus on are the edges, because we will never cross these deterministic unstable thresholds in the interiors. Now, what we do get from HH1 to its other sides are basically neutral steps. Now, one way to read this is that, okay, you start with a population of HH1 and say you have a very small fraction, which is of HS1. Now, HS1 individuals, they are also hunting hares in and with the preference of reality 1. If they happen to be in reality 2, they would hunt stags, but that is immaterial because they will never see a reality 2. Because over here, everyone favors 1. Over here, everyone favors 1. And that's why there is just neutral evolution between these 2 points. Once you have enough of these HS1, say by chance you get an HS2 individual. And this is where you start seeing a directional flow. And this is because HS1, while they do play stag in reality 2, it wasn't realized before because most of the individuals were preferring reality 1. But as soon as you have HS2 individuals and they rise to appreciable frequencies, there will come a point when suddenly a group will decide, all right, we have enough individuals who are actually believing in reality 2. Let's try out what happens if we choose reality 2. And as soon as they do, they get a larger payoff of a stag. And that's why you get a directional selection over here. A similar story happens if on this edge, and one can provide a reasonable explanation why as well. But the interesting point is once you cross over to the side of be playing a stag strategy, one can always have beliefs which are still in reality 1. Now, how do we explain that? I'll come to that in a minute. But before that, this is again for people who are interested in how do you do the analysis of this. So in a finite population, one switches from these binomial sampling, which I mentioned earlier, to become a hypergeometric where the population size is not just infinitely large anymore. So we don't have these unstable equilibria, which are very strict. So one can actually do a finite population analysis. And these results are analytical results where you see that in the end, the equilibrium abundance of strategies even for small enough populations is still biased towards the strategies which are hunting stags, given whatever choice of reality do they have. But we could also go for different conformism strategies, right? Earlier I said that people choose which reality they are in this frequency dependent manner. But what if the group chooses its reality with a fixed probability that no, we need to have 50% of individuals to believe in a certain reality, and only then we choose that reality to happen. Now, in this case, we actually see that it's very hard to move out actually of HH1 situation, HH1 at all, because you have an unstable equilibrium at this point and only neutral over here. So a fixed reality is very hard to get out. Fixed choice of probability is very hard to get out of. But if you apply certain different kind of conformism strategies like a majority vote, or what we also tried something else, which is like a leader-follower situation where you always have a charismatic leader who tells the group what is a good thing to do, what is a bad thing to do. In that case, you can actually get some kind of cycles, but eventually you maintain this directionality, which allows you to go towards the stag side. Now, this was an exploration of having these beliefs, but I did not say like what would come as a cost of having these beliefs and what would happen if you have these beliefs coming at a cost. Because earlier it didn't really matter what your belief was because you could just switch to a different strategy, which was not costly. But if you add cognitive costs to your beliefs, then one sees that, okay, if you do add more and more of a cost, you still see a move towards the stag strategy. But in that case, the stag strategy, which is being preferred, is that which still believes in reality one. And this is what I meant earlier, that you do see in the equilibrium, the Stag strategies, which still believe in reality one. Now, this does not mean that the movement of believing in the second reality is not important, because over here are some of the simulation results which kind of tell you why reality two is important. And that's because reality two acts as a stepping stone towards moving towards a Stag equilibrium. And once individuals are in the Stag equilibrium, then it becomes clear, oh, having the belief is actually costly, so we can get rid of the belief. But now, since everyone is hunting stags, there is no point switching back to hunting a hare, because that has a lower payoff. And that's how individuals then get stuck in the Stag equilibrium, which is the trusting equilibrium, but they can renounce their beliefs of whether they be fictional or whatever they were, which help them transition over to the Stag side. And this is basically what I'm trying to summarize over here. That drift takes care of the belief in narratives. And once the number of believers crosses a certain threshold, then selection for those narratives is triggered. And then the narratives exert a force in the real world, because then they start actually moving the population over to the Stag side. And the individuals who believe in the narratives, they cooperate, and then they have a higher fitness, as stags are giving you a larger fitness than hares in this case. But once cooperation is stable, then the individuals, they can actually renounce their beliefs, but they are still stuck being cooperative, because actually that is the rational thing to do then in that case, because once you are actually at this cooperative equilibrium, there is no point going back, because there is no temptation to defect in this case. The cycle actually then can repeat with a different belief system, which might, if it gives you a higher payoff, then that can rise up to an appreciable frequency. And this is the process which we did not explore in our manuscript, but this is exactly the kind of process which gives rise to this rich tapestry of beliefs, then which are hard to find out why a certain belief actually did come to prominence and why certain beliefs do not. But they get hidden because of these layered cycles. And examples of such kind of belief systems, which actually are not belief systems anymore, but we consider them as realities, are also not just money, but like corporate entities, nations, and societies. And clearly, of course, superstitions, rituals. But there is also a dark side to beliefs, because in this case, as I said, like I did not consider the moral content of the belief, right? The narratives and fictions, they only needed to provide a higher payoff to the actors. The content in principle, that did not matter. So at least in the short run, because the content doesn't matter, things like sensationalism or fake news can spread much faster as long as they provide this short-term benefit. But probably in the long run, that's exactly, it leads to its own demise. And this is something which we have been exploring in this manuscript. Now I want to break it right there at that point, because now I want to jump actually where I put all these things together with what seemed like completely disparate themes of research, but where they all come together is in the form of this translational research. And here I'm talking now, again, jumping across very broad topics, which are things like agriculture and evolutionary medicine, where we have been working on like then understanding the role of fluctuating selection and the control of resistance evolution, and basically how one can use similar principles from a computational point of view to understand yield increase and pest resistance in agriculture, as well as in basically maintaining healthy cells, as well as controlling resistance evolution in evolutionary medicine. But the point which I want to make with this is that any of these kind of different technologies that we are looking at, from agriculture to the social evolution, these are the kind of topics we explore more and more in this translational point of view, like from the first study, which I talked about on synthetic interventions, engineering ecosystems. I didn't talk about gene drives, which is some work that we have been doing. And this is the agriculture part, which I mentioned. But most of these translated topics, they come from this continuum of fundamental to translational, where these are the kind of topics which we are actually actively pursuing. And these are the topics which we are interested in and moving towards because of very nice interactions with our collaborators, which is an amazing thing to do. And what this leads to is a connection to how precise things are getting, moving from these kind of abstract topics to something which is very controllable, and our interventions are getting better and better and more stronger actually in the real world, with especially also with the beliefs, which I did talk about. We have been exploring topics such as the future of belief systems and digital human interactions, where most of our belief systems are now being controlled, right, in one way or the other by algorithms, whether we want them to or not. And this is where I come to this control problem, which is very well known in AI and machine learning. But what I want to say is that the control problem doesn't exist just in the AI community, because what I stopped the synthetic biology part of the talk at, or where I stopped with the beliefs topic at, we are running into control problems at all these scales, but they are not as obvious many times, or they are not brought out into our societal discourse as much as I think they should be, because these problems are actually being actively used, and these technologies are being actively used, and they can subversively rise to prominence without us ever knowing about it. For example, both in synthetic biology to social evolution, the thing is, can we define the question accurately? Just like the long tail problem of ML in machine learning, like, do we actually know when we want to release a symbiotic system in the coral reef? Do we know that this fixing the coral reef is actually the right thing that we want to do, or is it going to cause any downstream problems which we have not taken care of? And talking about solutions, can we define the range of answers that are acceptable to us? Now, this is, one can think of it as an across the scale trolley problem, which doesn't really have any one particular right answer, but it is still something that we need to think of now before these technologies are released in the world. And believe me, so we have been dealing with gene drive, the federal government over here. So we are working together with the advisors, which are getting hammered with a lot of from a lot of companies who want to release different kinds of gene drives, and then they need to evaluate the risks, the costs and benefits of releasing such a drive into the wild population. But of course, like as of now, none of those have been given any explicit permissions. But just the fact that these technologies are knocking on our doors, we need to think of their downstream effects before such kind of technologies are being released. And with precisely that point, I would like then to advertise that we do have a PhD position, which in our case is a 3-year PhD position, which would be a Marie Curie fellowship, which is going to focus exactly on combining complex evolutionary games, epidemiology, which is not just in the sense of the virus dynamics that we are seeing right now, but in general, how things spread, both from ideas to viruses, and making use of social and genetic learning algorithms. And if you know of anyone who is interested, then please feel free to forward these links to them. With that, I would like to actually thank a number of collaborators and wonderful colleagues without which this wouldn't have been possible, and our funding agencies. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Chaitanya. Any questions?
I have one. So very interesting. Yes, very interesting talk. I have two comments. One, you refer at the end that sensationalism and fake news bring their own demise. That was that's a hypothetical, right? I don't think that is actually true, and without a response from society overall. And this is like saying that religion, will bring their own demise, which is also hasn't,
no.
doesn't seem to be a right statement.
No.
And,
yeah. So I would, okay. Yeah, that's a very good point. I would like to clarify that, like, if it comes at a, if it gives a, if it's costly to the whole community that follows it, then that might be problematic. So, for example, in certain cults, maybe you could also say it is costly to some of the individuals within that who follow that, but not to all. And if that still is valid, then the belief can still persist in the population, because all you need are a certain number of charismatic or the individuals who are able to basically perpetuate the belief into the next generation. So that is true. I mean, if it only is costly to everyone who is involved in it, then that would bring its own demise, but otherwise, no.
And what do you mean by morals? I mean, you referred to morals a couple of times during your seminar, and that also is something that is so hard to define from an evolutionary point of view. What do you mean by that? Yes.
Okay. So that's actually a good question, because one could use these words like in a generic manner, which is not nice and which is not advised. But morals in this case means very specific things. Like, for example, in this study of so I hope you see it. Yes.
Yeah.
So in this, they have very clear definitions of what they mean by actually morals. So the morals are the ones which have a certain messages for social behavior. So it is a very precise definition. Yes, it's not a generic.
Okay.
So something which tells individuals how one should behave in a social situation. And then it gives examples using stories.
Yeah.
So yeah, please, yeah, that was very right. So it's not a loose terminology. Actually, it is quite well defined in that sense.
Great. John, do you have a question?
Yes. First of all, thank you very much for the talk. It was fantastic, very thought-provoking. I also had a similar question about when you brought up, well, maybe not a similar question, but off the same topic, when you talked about sensationalism and short-term payoff and that sort of thing. And I'm curious if you looked into, with your models, looked into resource management and kind of like a tragedy of the commons sort of thing. Let's say if there were, the equilibrium tends towards hunting stags, but let's say there's not enough stags to go around.
That's an excellent point, actually. So what we, and this is something that we are actually trying to explore right now, that both the models, like one of them is like basically infinitely large populations, and other one is finite populations. But in finite populations, the population size is still fixed. And what we are trying to explore right now is what happens when you go to a stag equilibrium. But so that actually enhances not just the payoff, but the payoff translates into the growth rate of the population. So then the population would expand. And as soon as it starts expanding, then what is it expanding into? And those questions matter a lot. And that's where we are trying to, well, then one runs into the problems of how much space is basically available. If you fill up the space, what are the costs of that? And yeah, we are actually exploring precisely that point. So thanks.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting, because you would think like the equilibrium tends towards the benefit of the community, but how much can you grow the community before that in itself is detrimental?
So the reason we are actually going in that direction is actually maybe this resonates with some ideas behind your question, hopefully, is that one of the interesting kind of transitions that we have had in human evolution is also that of agriculture. And agriculture massively increased the carrying capacity of the human population, well, actually of the human population, but it came at grave costs as well to the population overall. And how do we manage basically this transition? And that's what we are trying to get exactly at that, because indeed we did get a lot, we could support a lot more people at a lower quality of life, well, comparatively lower quality of life, apparently. That's the current hypothesis, at least. So this exact trade-off between the societal benefit of the large number of individuals versus an individual cost of the quality of life is something that we want to look at. And this goes in the direction of resource management.
Very exciting.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah. I'm not sure I answered it properly, but yeah.
No, I thought it was great.
Do you think that there can be cooperation without antagonism? I mean, like in a
Sorry, Carlos, can I stop you for a second? I think Irene is next, and then you can go.
Thanks, Juana. So that was super cool. I actually had a question about the first part of your talk, a bit outside the scope of what you went over, but I was wondering if when you added these various stressors, so the point source enrichment and the seasonal introduction versus the permanent change, you looked at how the yeast gene expression changed in response to these stressors to see if, you know, you noticed anything interesting there, and what, you know, if you found any gene expression associated with symbiosis or response to stress, things like that.
So first thing I want to clarify is those are only population dynamics. There is no evolution actually happening, because those engineered yeast, they are so bad and they are so sick that as soon as they try to do anything else, they just die.
I see.
So, so they are really, so I mean,
so you don't think they're evolving to adapt? You think that most of them are just dying off?
But what you are asking is like a very good question, because like once we want to release these things outside in the ecology, one needs to be aware that they could be subject to evolution, right? And then we need to put traps, basically tripwires within the genome, so that they either do not evolve, or like they do not evolve, period. So as soon as they move away from the current genomic construct, they just die, or they evolve only in a certain manner, which is much more harder to direct then. So the way these are constructed is that they just do not evolve.
Got it.
But there is the lab of Christian Kost, who work on evolved mutualism, where you actually evolve this mutualism, whereas these ones are engineered.
Got it. Thank you.
So yeah, that's a difference. Yes, thanks for asking this clarifying question.
Carlos, do you want to ask a second question? Let's see. Do I have anyone else?
I have a question actually.
Alicia?
Yeah. So like, I'm always curious for this kind of modeling, like the.
Sorry, could you?
Can you hear me?
Okay, no, it's better. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So for this kind of modeling work, I'm always curious about the parameterization, because the conclusions that you get would depend a lot on the set of parameters that you choose. And in your model, there are like a lot. So how robust were the trends that you were seeing? Or alternatively, like what is the reasonable way of parameterizing the model?
So I got the question about the parameterization and all of that, but you're still like asking about the first part, right? First model, because
I was asking about the second one actually.
The second one. Yeah, okay, right. No, that's very good that you asked that. So the only constraint actually that we need actually for the second one to work is that it needs to be a coordination game. So what I mean by that is, I hope that's right, this one, right? So that it needs to be a coordination game where basically you have this unstable equilibrium. And the payoff matrix, which all the payoff matrices basically, which conform, that give you a coordination point in the end, these are subject to basically the results of our model. If you change the game to be something like that of a prisoner's dilemma, in which you have a directional selection towards defectors, then actually the amount of temptation or amount of the difference between the temptation and the sucker's payoff, if you are familiar with some of those type of terminologies, basically the entries of this payoff matrix, then they matter a lot. And in finite populations, you can still get results which are consistent with our model, but not in infinite populations. So we chose the stag hunt per se because this is this classically defines the tension between social and the individual gains versus that prisoner's dilemma is not really telling us anything about trust in that sense between between multiple individuals and forming a contract. And that's one of the reasons, because a prisoner's dilemma definitely doesn't have an unstable threshold in between. So this is basically the only requirement.
Thank you.
And population size too, right? Because you also see infinite populations versus you had that little plot where population size is also another parameter that may change qualitatively what's happening in the system. I'm very proud that my students are asking questions about parameters, so that's why I'm jumping in.
No, that's actually very good, because what I want to say about finite populations is that, so okay, these are still analytical results, first of all. And of course, when the population size gets very large, then yes, then we are in the limit of this basically replicator dynamics, where this is what we get, that all these 4 strategies are at 1/4 frequency. And for small populations, and by small, then we mean, okay, say 16 or 32. I mean, so the results don't really get affected that much, I would say, by small populations, because yeah, you do see persistence of some of these previous strategies, but even for small enough populations, you still have a dominance of the stag strategies. Yeah.
Actually, my question was along those lines, that in biology, you always see cooperativity sort of side by side with uncooperativity or antagonism, right? Which is in this case, I think what Juana was mentioning, right? That the finite population is cooperativity alone doesn't solve the problem, right? Because you run out of hair, so you run out of food, and so there must be some antagonistic or uncooperative sort of parameter in the model, to reach some equilibrium.
I think we would see that once we include some kind of an eco-evolutionary dynamics, where you have this, where you have the resources co-evolving together with this thing. Yes, then we
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions? We're over time anyway, so thank you so much again, Chaitanya. This was really fun. You showed us 2 adventures, and I'm looking forward to future ones.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, it was great actually talking to you. And thanks for the questions. It was wonderful.
Great. Bye, everyone.
Bye.